Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. This is part one of a two-part interview about Ernie Pyle. From 1942 to 1945, Ernie Pyle was the most famous American war correspondent. In 1942, his columns were featured in 42 newspapers. By 1945, they were featured in 400 daily and 300 weekly newspapers. He covered the war from the Blitz to North Africa, to Italy to Normandy, and then the Pacific. The American public found his writing human and accessible. Those in combat found him a particular ally, someone who understood suffering, someone who could explain a little bit of what they were experiencing to those back home. And to tell us more about Pyle, we are joined today by David Chrisinger, author of The Soldier's Truth, Ernie Pyle and the Story of World War II. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is a real pleasure.
So start us off with a little bit about Ernie Pyle's early life.
It's safe to say that being a war correspondent was actually his fourth profession. When it came to journalism, he started off as a beat reporter, doing stories, day-to-day deadlines, that sort of thing. He found that he had a special skill for writing headlines and for writing, sort of helping other people rewrite their pieces to be more concise and more clear. And that was something he showed an aptitude for really young. And he worked his way up into an editorial role where he was, helping other people with their writing and again, getting things really clear and concise. Then he goes from being a beat reporter to an editor. Then he starts the very first column focusing specifically on aviation. And he wrote about pilots and test flights and new aircraft. And he really got to know everybody in that space. He was friends with Amelia Earhart. He probably, if the war had never started, he would have gone down as, fairly famous for being one of the first writers in this space. So he develops this column and all these different friendships. And then he goes back to being an editor and sort of burns out on that again and pitches to his bosses that he wants to actually be demoted and he wants to become a roving correspondent. And this was during the Depression. And what he did was he drove all over the country. He crisscrossed the United States 35 times. He visited every single state, including Alaska and Hawaii. He traveled all over Canada, all over Central America, and he wrote a daily column about his travels and the people that he met and the stories that he heard. So by the time the war starts, he's basically met everyone from everywhere. He knows all these pilots who are now becoming bomber pilots and fighter pilots in the war. He's been everywhere. He's seen everything. And he's got this really special skill of writing very clearly and concisely and writing in a way that made people really connect with him, and to where he had this sort of little following of people who felt that they really knew him and understood him. So that's all before the war even starts. And so when people say well, how did this guy with no, war correspondence experience, no understanding really of international affairs or foreign policy, no combat experience, and by the way, he's in his 40s, and he's got white hair and he's small and he's frail. How did that guy become the most famous war correspondent of his time and arguably of all time? And I think it's because he had basically done everything and seen everything and knew everyone, and he fit in everywhere that he went. And that really helped him get close to soldiers and sailors and airmen and sort of hear their stories and really understand what they were going through, and then found a way to translate that really clearly, really concisely to an American public that really started to see him as as like a distant relative writing letters home. So it's like, if you look at his early life, his success as a war correspondent makes total sense. But if you only look at his time as a war correspondent, you can sort of have that initial reaction of like, how did this guy become the most famous? Why him? Why not somebody else? Why not the, Ernest Hemingways of the world, or, the John Steinbecks, or these other, famous writers who were over there? How did Ernie Pyle beat them all? It was because he told these human stories. It was because he fit in everywhere. It's because he suffered right along with the people that he was writing about. And like you said, he knew something of suffering even before the war started.
Well, that brings me to my next question. So I think the common view of Pyle is that he was, again, very perceptive. He's very thoughtful. Also that he's somewhat melancholy. And before reading your book, I really had no idea how deep his suffering was, or the role that his wife's mental health struggles kind of played in that. So what can you tell us about this?
My biography, The Soldier's Truth, is the latest Ernie Pyle biography. He's been the subject of previous biographies. And when you look at those previous biographies, they were written in the mid 90s and the late 80s and the early 50s. And I think those were times when, for whatever reason, there was a reluctance to get into the sort of mental health discussions. And maybe it was a fear of like not wanting to psychoanalyze someone from a distance, or not wanting to, talk about someone's mental health struggles in a way that might detract from their heroic status, in American culture, whatever the reason is. Both Ernie Pyle's mental health struggles and his wife, Geraldine, but everyone called her Jerry, her struggles as well, are sort of, briefly mentioned here, referenced there, a clause in a sentence here. There wasn't ever really an in-depth look at it. And as I started doing the archival research for this book, it's really fortunate that Ernie's letters have all been archived. Letters to his wife, letters to his best friend from college, letters to his editors. So I got a really sort of in-depth look at how he understood his own mental health and how he understood his wife's mental health issues. And what we found, or what I found in the archives, was that Ernie struggled with depression for a long time. I think he dealt with that in a way lots of people dealt with depression at that time, which was with alcohol. He was a heavy user of alcohol, and he would go through these sort of regular periods, and then really, sort of fall into the bottom of a hole for a little while. And lots of times, Jerry was there with him on the road, doing work with him, where she was able to kind of help pull him out of those down spots, those sort of dark sides of his cycle, help him through that, reassure him that he was a good writer, that he was doing important work, help sort of deal with that melancholy. And they like to drink together, and that's one thing they had in common. And one thing that starts to happen in the late 30s is Jerry's mental health really deteriorates. Now, I talked to a couple of different physicians, just kind of off the record, about, hey, if you had a patient that presented all of these issues, what would your sort of initial thought be? And both told me, oh, that sounds like bipolar disorder. So I think that Jerry would have likely been diagnosed with some form of bipolarism or bipolar disorder. And, this was at a time before that diagnosis was recognized, before there was any medication that could have been administered. And so she finds herself, going through these really high highs, these really low lows. She starts, thinking about suicide. She attempts suicide a couple of times. Ernie says in kind of a half-hearted way, like a cry for help. She was institutionalized several times. Doctors at the time, gave her all these really wild treatments. Like, she was encouraged to drink alcohol, then she wasn't allowed to drink alcohol. They prescribed her barbiturates. They, gave her electric shock therapy. I mean, Jerry could have been the subject of a book on sort of like the messed up ways that women's mental health was treated in the 1940s. And she could have been like the character that tied it all together. But this pattern starts to develop where Ernie really needs Jerry, right? He needs her to help him on his journey. And when she's not able to do that, they have this real sort of disruption, this cleavage, right? Of like, she can't be the wife that he needs her to be. And he and Jerry at one point engage in a sort of throuple situation where, Jerry's mental health had gotten so bad that she recognized Ernie needed a companion and was like, gave a blessing to that. They had a very complicated, sort of very modern, almost sort of marriage. Speaking of bad treatments, the doctor even recommended they get divorced, thinking that would shock her into, giving up her melancholy. I mean, it's laughable now, but this was like the science back then, right? And so this pattern develops where when Ernie's gone, she starts to get better. They bought a house in Albuquerque. She's decorating the house. She's feeling good. And then Ernie comes home and things are great. And then he's about to leave again. And then she just, takes a dive. And it gets worse and worse each time to where, eventually she needs to be institutionalized full time. So Ernie's got that sort of situation going on at home the whole time he's overseas. Every time he's back home, when he's sleeping in foxholes, he's, also agonizing over Jerry's health and the sort of status of their relationship. And, part of me wonders if, Ernie having the experience with depression, the experience with, trying to cope with alcohol, the experience of being married to someone who's also dealing with mental health issues, that sort of suffering and tragedy, and if that didn't sort of wise him up in a certain way so that he was able to sort of recognize grief and struggle and frustration and anxiety and all these things that he was seeing in these young soldiers. And he had that age and that experience and that, sort of being in that place, and he could articulate it in a way that, most young soldiers weren't able to, if that wasn't, part of what made him a success, right? And so it's not to say like, hey, if you want to be a really great writer, you better have like a really depressing life. But I would also argue that a lot of great writers have struggles with depression and have, family histories of suffering and tragedy. And so there's got to be, if it's not cause and effect, it's certainly a correlation.
So Pyle covers the Blitz in 1940, and then he comes back home. And then when the U.S. enters the war, does he initially want to cover the war? And how does he end up then in North Africa?
Well, he has a really sort of indirect route there. When he got home from the Blitz, he returned to doing roving correspondent work. He was driving all over the place, and he was up in Canada. And this is at one of the times where Jerry's mental health really takes a nosedive. And so he returns home, and the doctor is basically saying she needs full-time care or she needs to be institutionalized. This is quite expensive. And Ernie's in this place where he's got to figure out what's his next move. So the options he had on the table, one was that he was eligible to be drafted. And some people might say, wait, didn't you say he was in his 40s and he's, 5'1" and weighs 100 pounds? And what do you mean he's draft eligible? Well, at the time, the Army was drafting professionals from the civilian workforce to do certain jobs in the military. And so the draft board would have likely drafted him to become like a press officer or a censor or, doing something in like war information work because of his experience as an editor in a newspaper. So his draft board told him, yep, you're eligible. You're going to come up in 6 months or 9 months or whatever it is. So he's got that in the back of his mind. Oh, I might get drafted and end up, he called it running a typewriter somewhere. So that's option one. Option two was he tries to get a job in, at the time, New Mexico is, this is the future home of Los Alamos. This is where there's a lot of arm manufacturing happening. There were lots of jobs that he probably could have gotten a deferment for if it was like integral to the war effort. So he could have gone to work. But then he said, no, I've been wrecked on that. I've been on the road for so long. I can't show up 9 to 5. Can't do it. So that option's off the table. Then he thinks, well, maybe I'll become a commissioned officer. Maybe I can work in intelligence, or I can, do something where I won't be in harm's way, but I'm contributing to the war. But then he's thinking, well, what impact is this going to have on Jerry if he's gone for who knows how long, right? So that doesn't feel very good. And then he talks to his editors and they say, well, one thing you could do is you could go to England where all the American troops are amassing and getting ready for the invasion of North Africa. And you can just kind of do your thing, do the Pyle treatment of going from camp to camp and listening to people and telling their stories and, being basically a roving correspondent, but in England. You can do that until you get drafted. And he decides that that's what he's going to do. He's going to go to England for maybe 6 months and then come home, get drafted, and then whatever happens, happens. Well, in his time in England, and he's doing the Pyle treatment, they call it. He's going from camp to camp. He's meeting soldiers. He's telling their stories. He's writing up, what are they eating? Where are they sleeping? What kind of training are they doing? How do they feel about the war? That kind of reporting. And what editors back in the United States found out was that that's what people really wanted to read, was what were their sons and their husbands and their fathers, what were they going through? What were they experiencing? What was it like? And what should people expect? So in the 6 months that he's there, the column that he's writing gets more and more popular. And Ernie's editors in Washington, D.C. talk to the draft board and they say, look, you can draft Ernie Pyle and you can turn him into a press officer, or you can give him a deferment and you can let him be a war correspondent, because don't you think that'll be much better for the war effort, is if we have Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent, not Ernie Pyle, the press officer. And the draft board says, well, we can't give him a deferment, but we can give him a non-deferment deferment and tell him good luck from us. So that's literally the goodwill that Ernie had sort of built up with his readers and with people that knew him, was that he was going to do a good thing for the war. And I do think that's part of what's really agonizing to him later on in the war, is that he was so necessary. He became so necessary to the war effort that he couldn't pull himself out of it.
So that's then how he ends up in North Africa.
Right. So right after the, non-deferment deferment arrives, once he gets the kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, you're not going to be drafted, he decides that he's going on an invasion. And he can't decide if he wants to go to the Pacific or if he should stay in England. And some general kind of gives him the elbow nudge and says, if you want to go on an invasion, just stay here in England because one's coming soon. And he ends up being part of the kind of reserve forces that arrive in North Africa. So he's not there for the initial fighting, which didn't last very long. It was pretty brutal for a short period of time until the French surrendered. But Ernie missed that initial push into North Africa, and he arrives again, sort of with some reserve forces, and is just trying to figure out, again, what am I doing? I've never covered a war before. I don't really know how to find stories in a war zone yet. And so he spends a lot of time in this headquarters city on the coast and just trying to get to know the players, the key players, the generals, who was most important, who could help him when he needed help. And he started noticing that the other correspondents who were in North Africa would wake up in the morning, they'd attend a briefing from the general, they'd find out where soldiers were in fighting or where things were happening. Then they would hop into a Jeep, drive to wherever that was happening, stay a couple hours, get a couple quotes, and then drive back and type up their story and submit it. And that he sort of thought of it as commuting to the war every day. And that was not his style. He felt like that was just not the Ernie Pyle way. So what he does instead is he attaches himself with a unit for 2-3 weeks. And he is sort of collecting stories in his mind and writing down names and addresses and making sure that he's finding those really human and personal details. And he's spending 2 to 3 weeks with them, living in foxholes, eating sea rations, doing all the things that soldiers do. And then he would come back to a city, find a hotel, and he would type up 15 columns in one, a weekend or a 5-day stretch. And then he'd send a big batch. And his column was running daily, 6 times a week. And in North Africa is where, again, his reporting was seen as the most real reporting. If you really wanted to understand what was happening to soldiers in North Africa, you had to read Ernie Pyle. And this was something even Eleanor Roosevelt wrote about in her own daily column, which was very popular at the time. She said, if you want to understand the war, if you want to understand what our soldiers are going through, you got to read Ernie Pyle. And that's really where, if you want to think about sort of where does Ernie's fame really explode, it's in North Africa.
So after North Africa, then he reports on Sicily, and he spends time with the Navy in preparation for the invasion. And it's a bit of a jarring experience for him. Why is that?
Yeah, he thought the sailors lived lives of luxury compared to the soldiers who were, sleeping in the field, and he had a very special affinity after North Africa for the infantry specifically. And what he really loved about the infantry was that they put up with everything. They put up with bad weather, they put up with bad food, they put up with no food, they put up with no sleep, no comfort, nothing human at all. And they somehow got through it. And so that was really like his benchmark of what is a true sort of American hero, right? Is like someone who will go through everything without complaint. Now that last part of without complaint, Ernie, learns that that's not true, eventually. But it is true that the infantry goes through literal hell, right? And so then he ends up on a ship, and everybody has a clean bed, everybody has a clean uniform, everybody eats 3 hot meals a day. You can drink Coca-Cola. The music plays on the loudspeakers. You can sit down on something that's not a rock. And this is like, oh, you guys don't know anything, right? You don't know what war is. You think this is war. Like, I've been to war. He has that. And anyone who knows military veterans, right, even today, they razz each other, the different branches, about who's a real, service member, who's a real veteran, who really went through whatever. And so but he also appreciates, a little break from the front lines. The front lines, can be, in Ernie's, estimation, they can be really sort of a boost to your resiliency, but they can also take a lot from you. And so this little time on the ship, he appreciated. He even worked for the ship's newspaper as an editor before he would go around and look for stories and then write his own columns for his own boss. But then he takes the ship to Sicily, and the Sicily invasion goes much more smoothly than the intelligence suggested it would. And the army makes incredible gains in the first few days. And all of a sudden, there's not really much going on for the Navy. They're either going to turn around and get more supplies, or they're going to stay there kind of in reserve. And that's when Ernie decides, okay, I'm going to go back with the infantry. I'm going to go back with the soldiers. And he lands in Sicily. He's, again, missed the initial invasion, but that's okay with him because he's not particularly interested in storming beaches. And he starts to really get fatigued at sort of a cellular level. Like, the war is starting to catch up with him to where he actually has to be admitted to a field hospital. And they called what battlefield fever. And the way that it came about was no sleep, too much dust, not enough water, not enough food. Again, just basically your body gives out on you. And I think it's this experience that's a real kind of hinge moment for Ernie, because he's in a tent with wounded soldiers. And at one point, some litter bearers brought in a young man on a stretcher and laid him down in the aisle. And then a priest came and gave the last rites to this young man. And Ernie's watching this, and he has this like incredibly strong impulse to get out of bed and like hold the man's hand in his last moments, but he doesn't because he's afraid that someone will judge him or that it will be improper. And then the man dies, and Ernie has this like incredible shame spiral for having sort of let this man die alone. And I think that was a moment for him where he was now really a part of the war. If before then he was an observer of the war, now he was in it and he was feeling it and he was being affected by it. And so he's not with the frontline troops so much in Sicily. He spends a lot of time with combat engineers. And that was actually a really fun part of the book to write and to do the research for. Ernie wrote this series of columns about a bridge that he said was hung in the sky that the combat engineers had to build in order for the infantry to continue to advance along the northern coast of Sicily. And what the Germans did was, well, if you've never been to Sicily, the northern coast is basically very mountainous, but the people that live there, carve these roads through the mountains and around the mountains. There's dozens and dozens of tunnels, dozens and dozens of bridges. And so as the German army is retreating back towards mainland Italy, they're blowing up every bridge, they're filling every tunnel with rubble, trying to slow the Allied advance. And so it's really, Ernie calls it the engineers' war. The engineers have to either clear the tunnel or fix the bridge for the infantry to advance. And that's like this very slow process. So Ernie watches this example of it where the Germans had basically bombed off like the side of a cliff that was right outside a tunnel and, made it seem impossible to be able to span that gap. And what Ernie watched over the course of 24 hours was these young combat engineers basically building this bridge that hung in the sky. And the first person that crosses the bridge is the general in charge of the army in Sicily. And it's this like really cool series of articles where it's like you're rooting for the engineers. You're sort of right along with them. Like, are they going to be able to build a bridge? Will the infantry be able to advance? And it's this real kind of different look at the war, right? And so when I was in Sicily doing research for the book, I was like, I have to find this place. Well, it's actually kind of like a side road now that's very rarely used, and they have this different highway that sort of cuts through the mountains. And so for several days I was driving, back and forth along there and didn't see anything that resembled the pictures. And then I found this little beach on my GPS and I pulled into the parking lot and I just decided I was going to sit in the sand and watch the waves and try to enjoy. That was my last day in Sicily. And then I saw this older man walking down the beach. He had this like suit on, like a windsuit, and he spoke very broken English, and I don't know Italian, and I'm trying to, use my hands to motion like I'm looking for a bridge. It's a cave. There's a tunnel, and he sort of points over his shoulder and says, "Oh, it's right over there." And so I take this little road and I find the bridge, and there's nobody behind me, and I stop the car and I get out and I take a picture from like the same angle as Ernie, would have seen it, and it's still there today. And that was just like one of the places that, Ernie wrote about in such detail to where you can find it, today even. And I found that all across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France. So that was a really cool part of doing this research. But it is to go back to Ernie in Sicily, that is the place that really sort of knocks the wind out of his sails. And he goes home from Sicily, misses the initial invasion into Italy. And when he returned home, that was, again, a time where he found that Jerry's mental health had really deteriorated. But he also found that he couldn't go anywhere without people recognizing him, without people wanting an autograph, without people wanting something from him, whether it was a speech, an appearance, a signature, donation, whatever it was. And his fame had sort of really come home to roost. And he found being in America much more anxiety inducing than being at the front lines. He started to sort of yearn for the simplicity of combat compared to what he had to deal with at home. And so again, that's part of the, one question I get all the time is, well, what kept him going? What made him continue from this campaign to that campaign to that campaign, and couldn't he have just stopped? And it's like his career just like took on this trajectory, this momentum that by the time the campaign for Sicily is over, like he's no longer in control.
That's the end of part 1. We will continue this discussion in part 2. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.